The courthouse ledgers were never meant to be read. They were meant to be filed, to gather dust, to become part of the silent, administrative sediment of history. Stacked in a forgotten basement of the old Richmond County Administrative Building, these leather-bound volumes had survived not through any act of preservation, but through sheer obscurity. They endured fires that licked at the edges of the city, floods that seeped into lower levels, and decades of willful neglect, their contents deemed too mundane, too bureaucratic, to warrant attention. They were accounting, not narrative, a record of property, not people. When the Richmond County Historical Preservation Society began its ambitious project to digitize historical documents in 2009, it was a race against mold, acidification, and time. The work was methodical, often monotonous. An intern named Rebecca Chen, a graduate student in history with a focus on the economic structures of the antebellum South, was assigned a box of plantation transfer logs from the 1840s. The room was hushed, the air cool and smelling of old paper and ozone from the scanners. For hours, her world was a rhythm. The gentle whir of the scanner, the rustle of a brittle page, the tap of keys as she entered metadata. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Most entries blurred into a predictable pattern. Transactions of land, equipment, and human beings reduced to columns of assets and liabilities. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a pattern of a different kind emerged. Rebecca's eye, trained to spot anomalies in data, caught a repetition. The name Martha, a common name unremarkable in isolation, appeared in a log from 1847. But it wasn't just a name, it was the attached details. Female. Age approximated. Literacy noted. She saw it again in a ledger from a different county, dated 1843. And again in a bill of sale from 1841. Within an hour, she had 5 separate entries, spanning from 1840 to 1848, from 5 different plantations across 3 states. Each entry was a cold, clinical snapshot, a purchase price, a list of skills, sometimes a terse reason for transfer. Disciplinary reassignment. Reduction of estate obligations. Reassignment of assets. The mathematical precision of it was what struck her first, the historian's mind assembling the data points into a chilling sequence. 5 plantations, 5 births, 5 sales, all within 7 years, all tracing the path of one woman. The implications, blooming darkly behind the neat script, made her hand still on the mouse. She felt a cold clarity, the kind that comes when abstract historical theory collides with the undeniable, personal evidence of its brutality. This wasn't just a statistical phenomenon. This was a documented life, a trail of paper breadcrumbs leading through a forest of suffering. She reached for her supervisor, her voice quiet but urgent in the silent archive. The discovery, she knew, would unravel one of the most disturbing systemic patterns ever laid bare in the antiseptic language of antebellum bookkeeping. But to understand what those ledgers truly revealed, what they documented in their cold numbers and dispassionate shorthand, we must follow the trail backwards, from the record to the reality. We need to go back to where it all began, not in the archive, but in the world. To a woman whose biography was written not in diaries or letters, which were forbidden to her, but in transaction receipts, birth records, and the merciless arithmetic of human commerce. Her story was encoded in the ledgers, but her life existed in the spaces between the entries. This is the story of Martha. The journey that would eventually become those ledger entries began on a humid Tuesday morning in April 1840. The air over the South Carolina lowcountry was thick enough to drink, carrying the scent of pluff mud, blooming jasmine, and the perpetual tang of the Charleston harbor. Martha, age 19, stood on the auction block in a brick warehouse near the wharves. The space smelled of salt water, sweat, fear, and tobacco smoke. She was not new to being inspected. Her body had been assessed and cataloged before, but the setting never lost its power to hollow her out. The men who examined her were planters, factors, and traders, their fine wool coats at odds with the crude surroundings. They peered at her teeth, assessed the strength in her hands, evaluated her posture for signs of weakness or defiance. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like gravel, highlighted her unusual qualities. prime female, 19 years of age, robust health, skilled in household management, cooking, sewing, laundering. Then came the differentiator, the detail that set her apart and sealed her fate. Documented literacy. Can read, write, and cipher. A murmur rippled through the crowd. In an era where teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in many southern states, punishable by law, her literacy was a dangerous paradox. It made her extraordinarily valuable for record-keeping, correspondence, and the management of complex households. Simultaneously, it made her threatening, a vessel of forbidden knowledge, a mind that could not be fully contained. The bidding grew competitive. When the gavel finally fell, the price was $800, a considerable sum, reflecting not just her youth and health, but the premium placed on her dangerous skill. The buyer was William Hargrove of Riverside Plantation, just across the Savannah River in Georgia. The bill of sale, preserved in the Charleston Municipal Archives, was a masterpiece of dehumanizing detail. It listed her as one would list a piece of machinery or livestock, noting her skills: reading, writing, arithmetic, needlework, cooking. There was no field for her memories. The face of her mother, sold away when Martha was 7. No column for her voice, which could recite passages from the Bible she'd secretly learned to read. No entry for her fear, which was a cold, sharp stone in her stomach as she was led away. Riverside Plantation sprawled across 1,200 acres of fertile bottomland. The main house was a 3-story Georgian structure with gleaming white columns, a statement of wealth and stability visible from the river. Behind it lay the brutal geometry of power: neat, endless rows of cotton, dependencies like the kitchen and laundry, and a line of small, cramped cabins known as the quarters. William Hargrove, 32, had inherited Riverside along with 63 enslaved people and considerable debt. He was a man obsessed with order and modern management, determined to restore profitability through meticulous accounting. His ledgers documented every bale of cotton, every bushel of seed, every penny earned and spent. And with the same dispassionate efficiency, they documented his human property. Riverside's ledger entry for Martha was characteristically brief: April 14, 1840. Martha, female, age 19, purchased Charleston auction. Cost $800. Skills: literate, household work. Assigned main house under supervision, Mrs. Hargrove. Her life contracted into a strict, exhausting routine. Her days began in the pre-dawn darkness, lighting fires, heating water, and cleaning with a precision that would be inspected with a ruler by her mistress, Eleanor Hargrove, a woman of pious severity. Martha learned the survival rules of the big house: move quickly but not frantically, speak only when spoken to, anticipate needs, become invisible until called upon. She made herself valuable and unremarkable, a ghost in the polished halls. This fragile, exhausting equilibrium shattered 3 months later with the arrival of Dutch Carmichael, the new overseer. Hired for his reputation in maintaining discipline and increasing productivity, Carmichael was a man of 35 with reddish hair and a face weathered by sun and cruelty. His modern systems meant earlier wake-ups, shorter breaks, and swift punishment. And soon his attention, cold, assessing, and possessive, settled on Martha. It started with his presence. He would appear near the kitchen when she drew water, linger by the laundry lines, his gaze a physical weight. He began creating reasons to summon her alone, to carry messages to distant fields, to check inventory in secluded storage sheds. The other enslaved women in the house, Dinah the cook, Esther from the kitchen, young Clara, saw it immediately. Their warnings were silent: a shake of the head, a hand briefly squeezed, a hissed whisper in the darkness of the quarters. Don't go nowhere alone. But there was no true safety, no law to appeal to. Her body was not her own. It was a piece of Hargrove property that Carmichael, as an agent of Hargrove, could command. In early August, the heat was a suffocating blanket. In the laundry house late one afternoon, with slanting sun creating harsh bars of light and shadow through the windows, he cornered her. The other workers had left. The door clicked shut. What happened in that room was never recorded in any ledger, journal, or letter. No official document would ever acknowledge the violence enacted there. Martha herself never spoke of it. Some truths are too heavy for words and must be carried silently in the bones, in the set of the jaw, in a permanent shift behind the eyes. But the pattern, the brutal, recurring script of her life, was initiated in that moment. A crime with no name in the law. Its only evidence would be written months later in her own body. By October, she knew. She felt the alien, unwelcome change within her. A cold terror, deeper than any she had known, took root alongside the growing life. She had seen this story play out before in the quarters. The pregnancy, the birth, the child becoming a commodity. The mother blamed for her own violation. She bound her midsection tightly with strips of cloth, hiding the evidence, working through nausea and fatigue with the same quiet efficiency, her mind racing through impossible options. By January 1841, concealment failed. Eleanor Hargrove's thin, strong fingers gripped her arm during a fitting. "You're with child," she stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. That evening, in William Hargrove's study, a conversation lasted 17 minutes. Servants in adjacent rooms heard raised, angry voices. 3 days later, the ledger recorded, January 19, 1841. Terminated Dutch Carmichael, overseer. Cause, violation of household policy. Paid final wages, $47. The problem of the man was administratively solved. The problem of Martha remained. She was moved to a dilapidated cabin at the farthest edge of the quarters, a place of isolation and shame. For 4 months, she lived in a limbo, visited only by Esther, who brought meager rations. The isolation was its own torture, but it gave her time to think, to grieve the life she was losing, and to fiercely love the one she was about to meet. On May 3, 1841, as a soft spring rain drummed on the roof, Martha gave birth to a daughter with the help of Aunt Sarah, the plantation midwife. After 14 hours of labor, in the flickering light of a single candle, she held her child. She named her Sarah, for the woman who had stayed with her. The plantation birth record noted, May 3, 1841. Infant girl born to Martha, house servant. Child healthy, weight approximates 7 pounds. Mother recovered from delivery. Father unknown. The 2 words, father unknown, were the first official lie in a long chain of them, a legal fiction that would be repeated like a grim refrain. For 6 precious weeks, Martha lived in a bubble of pure, desperate love. She nursed Sarah, memorized her face, sang to her in whispers. This was the only time in Sarah's life she would have her mother's undivided attention, free from the looming shadow of the ledger. The bubble burst on a humid morning in late June. William Hargrove appeared at her cabin door with a stranger in a fine coat, Vernon Hughes, a slave trader. They conversed outside as if discussing livestock, which, in their eyes, they were. Hargrove's knock was perfunctory. "Martha," he said, his voice devoid of anything but business. "You and the child have been sold. Mr. Hughes here will be transporting you to a new situation. You have 30 minutes to gather your belongings." The ledger entry was ready. June 28, 1841. Sale of Martha, age 20, and infant daughter to Hughes Trading Company, Charleston. Sale price $750. Reason for sale, disciplinary reassignment. Proceeds applied to a state operating fund. In 30 minutes, a life was packed away. Wrapping Sarah in cloth, clutching a comb, a spare dress, and a small wooden cross Esther had secretly given her, Martha stepped out of the cabin. In the distance, Esther and Dinah stood as silent witnesses, their faces etched with a sorrow too profound for words. Their silent message was clear. "I'm sorry. God be with you." Martha climbed into the back of Hughes's wagon, joining other stunned, newly purchased people. As the wheels crunched on the gravel drive, she looked back once. She saw the white columns gleaming, the fields where people toiled, the row of cabins, the isolated hut where she had become mother. She would never see Riverside again. But the pattern established there, the attention, the violence, the birth, the sale, would travel with her, a ghost in the wagon. It was a template for suffering. And as the wagon jolted north, Martha, holding her sleeping daughter, was unaware that this was only the first verse in a terrible, repeating song. The courthouse ledgers were waiting, their blank pages ready to document the next chapter. The wagon ride from Riverside to Fairmont Estate lasted 3 days, a journey through the pine forests and red clay hills of Georgia. Vernon Hughes was an efficient man, his operations governed by tight schedules and narrow profit margins. To him, Martha and her infant daughter were not a mother and child, but a single lot of stock purchased for $750 that needed to be moved quickly and sold for a gain. They stopped only for the horses, for quick purchases of cornbread and salt pork for his cargo, and to lock his human property in the sheds of roadside taverns while he slept in a bed. In the wagon, Martha learned the chilling mechanics of the trade. They were not heading to a specific buyer. They were inventory on a circuit. Hughes would stop at Plantations along his route, presenting his merchandise, haggling over prices, turning lives into margin. On the third day, the wagon turned up a long, oak-lined drive toward a substantial house. This was Fairmont Estate, a 600-acre tobacco plantation in central Georgia, owned by brothers Charles and Edmund Beaumont. The property was struggling. Falling tobacco prices and poor harvests had strained its finances. Charles Beaumont, a portly man of 50 with an air of perpetual worry, had sent word he was interested in a literate female servant. The negotiation occurred in the dusty front yard under the searing July sun, with Martha standing nearby, 8-week-old Sarah in her arms. Hughes presented her documentation, emphasizing her literacy and household skills, downplaying her recent history. Charles Beaumont tested her, having her read aloud from a tobacco buyer's circular. Her voice was steady, a skill that now felt like a curse. The haggling was brutal in its casual cruelty. Hughes wanted $850. Charles argued that a woman with an infant was a liability, the child a drain on resources for years. They settled on $650. The Fairmont Ledger recorded the transaction with cold clarity. July 2, 1841. Purchased one female Negro, Martha, age 20, with infant daughter, approximate 8 weeks old. Purchase price, $650. Skills, documented reading, writing, household service. Assignment, field work, tobacco cultivation. The 2 words, field work, tobacco cultivation, struck Martha with physical force. At Riverside, for all its horrors, she had worked in the relative shelter of the house. Field work meant the gangs. It meant sun that blistered the skin, overseers with whips, a relentless pace that broke bodies and spirits. And she would have to do it with an infant strapped to her chest. Charles Beaumont saw her reaction and misinterpreted it as insolence. "You'll do as you're told," he snapped. "Your literacy don't exempt you from honest work. You'll join the tobacco gangs starting tomorrow morning." Fairmont was a world of cramped deprivation. Martha was assigned to a cabin no larger than 12 by 14 feet, sharing the dirt-floored space with 2 other women, Patience and Ruth, and their children. Privacy was impossible, sleep a fractured luxury. Tobacco work was a particular kind of torture, detailed, repetitive, and performed in extremes. She transplanted seedlings in the spring mud, picked fat, green tobacco worms off leaves by hand in the stifling summer heat, and hauled heavy, resinous stalks in the autumn. All while Sarah, bound to her in a sling, cried from hunger, heat, or discomfort, drawing the overseer's wrath. She learned to work through a haze of exhaustion, to nurse her child in stolen moments between rows, to become a machine of endurance. Charles Beaumont was often absent, consumed by financial troubles and social obligations. Day-to-day management fell to his younger brother, Edmund Beaumont, a bachelor of 42 who lived on the property. Edmund was a man of volatile moods, readable in his gait and the smell of whiskey on his breath. The workers knew a loose, confident walk meant a tolerable day. A tense, purposeful stride promised cruelty. Within 2 weeks, Edmund began singling Martha out. The pretext was her literacy. He would summon her to the plantation office, a small building near the tobacco barn, to read agricultural journals and market reports he struggled to comprehend. At first, the sessions were brief and businesslike, but they grew longer, occurring in the late afternoon when the field hands had returned to the quarters. His questions shifted from crop yields to her past, to Riverside. His compliments on her intelligence became remarks on her appearance. "Field work is too harsh for someone refined," he'd say, his hand lingering on her shoulder as he pointed to text. The other women in the cabin saw the danger. Patience, who had lost 3 children to sail, whispered a warning one evening as they prepared a meager dinner. "That man's trouble. Been like this long as I've been here. You mind yourself here." But minding herself was a meaningless concept. An enslaved woman had no legal self to mind. She was property, and Edmund Beaumont held absolute power over that property. Her only strategy was the old one: endure, make herself invisible, survive. By late October, the pretenses had fallen away entirely. The reading sessions in the isolated office were for a different purpose. Martha would emerge later each time, her face a carefully neutral mask, her eyes distant. She spoke of it to no one. There was nothing to say. The language of their shared understanding was silent, spoken in the sympathetic downward glances of Patience and Ruth, in the extra piece of cornbread left for her. In early December 1841, the familiar, crushing realization came. She was pregnant again. Sarah was just 7 months old. This time, Martha didn't bother with concealment. What was the point? The pattern was proving itself immutable. She worked in the fields until her body could no longer hide the truth, until the overseer moved her to lighter duties. In late May, Charles Beaumont returned from Savannah. Rumors about his brother and the literate servant traveled fast on a small plantation. The confrontation in the main house was loud enough for the servants to hear. Charles's roar of anger, Edmund's defensive protests. It ended with Edmund retreating to his cottage for 2 days. On June 12, 1842, attended by Patience, Martha gave birth to a son. The labor was shorter, but more difficult, her body weakened by malnutrition and despair. She named him Daniel, meaning God is my judge, though her faith in any just divinity was fraying to nothing. The Fairmont birth record noted, June 12, 1842. Male infant born to Martha, field worker. Child healthy, weight approximates 6 pounds. Mother survived difficult labor. Father unknown. The legal fiction was repeated, a lie for the ledger that everyone alive at Fairmont understood. 6 weeks later, the machinery of the pattern engaged. A slave trader named Foster, specializing in quick turnovers, arrived from Augusta. The negotiation with Charles Beaumont was swift. The ledger entry was ready. August 3, 1842. Sale of Martha, age 21, and 2 infant children to Foster and Sons Trading, Augusta. Sale price $700. Reason: reduction of unnecessary estate obligations. She was sold for $50 more than her purchase price, but $75 less than her original value at Riverside. The arithmetic of her devaluation had begun. Patience helped her pack in a silent, tearful hurry. "You got strength," Patience whispered in a fierce embrace. "More strength than anyone should need. You remember that. These babies got you." Martha climbed into Foster's wagon with Sarah, now 15 months old, and Daniel, just 7 weeks. As they pulled away, she saw Edmund Beaumont watching from his cottage window, his face a blank slate. She had been at Fairmont for 13 months. 2 plantations, 2 pregnancies, 2 sales. The pattern was now a trap, and it was closing around her. Foster's operation was a brutal lesson in the domestic slave trade scale. For 2 weeks, Martha and her children were held in a warehouse near the Augusta River, a place of constant crying and casual family separation. She lived in terror that Foster would see more profit in selling them apart. But he seemed to think the family unit had a market. On August 18, 1842, his wagon approached Oakwood Plantation, a colossus of the Cotton Belt. With over 2,000 acres worked by nearly 200 enslaved people, Oakwood represented old money and old power, owned by the Presbyterian, publicly pious Prescott family. The negotiation was more refined, but no less a market transaction. Foster dealt with Robert Prescott, but the formidable Eleanor Prescott, the mistress of the house, took personal charge of inspecting Martha. She tested her reading from the Bible, her penmanship on a slate. Martha performed, presenting herself as capable and compliant, her children as future assets, not burdens. The sale was made. The Oakwood record stated, August 18, 1842, purchase of one female, Martha, aged 21, with 2 infant children. Purchase price $625. Skills, literate, household service. Assignment, spinning house, general household support. The assignment to the spinning house was a reprieve. The work, sitting at a wheel, turning cotton into thread, was tedious but not back-breaking, and it was indoors. Most importantly, Eleanor Prescott decreed that mothers could keep young children nearby. Martha created a nest of blankets in a corner for Sarah and Daniel. For 3 months, a fragile, watchful stability took hold. The other women in the spinning house offered fragmented kindness. The food was slightly better. Sundays offered rest. It was not freedom, not safety, but it was a pause in the cycle of terror. The pause ended with the return of James Prescott, the youngest son, from the University of Virginia, 23, handsome, and imbued with the unshakable confidence of a man who has never been denied. He was full of theories about modern plantation management. Touring the spinning house with his father, his gaze settled on Martha. "This one," he said, pointing. "She's literate, you said?" His interest was immediately, dangerously piqued. Within days, James had engineered her reassignment. Her literacy, he argued, was wasted on the wheel. She should maintain the production logs in the small, attached office. It seemed like a promotion. It was an isolation cell. The office was separate from the main room, private. James found endless reasons to be there, reviewing logs, discussing agricultural journals. His arm would brush hers. He complimented her intelligence, her voice. The pretense of professionalism was thin and quickly discarded. The door would close. His commands were explicit. Martha, once again, had no power to refuse the son of her owner. By March 1843, the inevitable result arrived. Her 3rd pregnancy in as many years. This time, her body rebelled. In her 4th month, she was gripped by a severe fever, pneumonia, complicated by pregnancy. She became too weak to work, confined to her cabin, drifting between life and death. Sarah, now 2, tried to care for Daniel, bringing Martha water with small, solemn hands. Eleanor Prescott, whether from compassion or concern for her investment, had Martha moved to a cabin near the main house and summoned a doctor, an extraordinary expense for an enslaved person. For 6 weeks, Martha hovered in the limbo of sickness, her survival in doubt. She slowly recovered, but the pregnancy had left her gaunt and permanently weakened. In September 1843, after a grueling 36-hour labor attended by the same doctor, she gave birth to another daughter. She named her Rebecca, to bind, for she felt irrevocably tied to her children and to this cycle of suffering. The Oakwood birth record documented the toll. September 12, 1843. Female infant born to Martha, spinning house worker. Difficult delivery following mother's severe illness. Mother and infant both survived labor. Heavy blood loss. Father unknown. In the aftermath, the familiar social mechanics word. Someone, likely a house servant who had seen James's visits, informed Robert Prescott. The quarters echoed with the sounds of the confrontation in the main house. Robert's thunderous rage, James's defensive shouts, Eleanor's icy interjections. James Prescott was exiled, sent to manage a remote family holding in South Carolina. For 10 weeks, Martha nursed Rebecca and cared for her 3 small children. She allowed herself a sliver of hope. The Prescotts were powerful. They valued her skills. Perhaps the pattern was broken. Perhaps they would let her stay. The hope died on a cold morning in late November, with the arrival of a well-dressed trader named Ashworth. After 2 hours of negotiation, the Oakwood Ledger made its final entry on Martha, November 29, 1843. Sale of Martha, age 22, and 3 children, ages 2 years 6 months, 1 year 4 months, 10 weeks to Ashworth Acquisitions, Charleston. Sale price $650. Reason, reassignment of assets due to changing household needs. The price had inched up slightly, perhaps for her resilience or the future labor potential of 3 children. But Martha saw the deeper truth. She was still worth $150 less than her original price, her value corroding with each transaction. As Ashworth's wagon rolled down the Oak Line Drive, Martha looked back at Oakwood, the plantation that had offered shelter only to prove it was another set in the same stage play. She was 22 years old. She had 3 children clinging to her. And the ledger's pattern was now an iron law. 3 plantations, 3 pregnancies, 3 sales. The script was written. All that remained was for her to live it out, again and again. Ashworth was a different breed of trader than the men who had come before, more polished, better connected, dealing in a higher grade of human stock. He operated not on the dusty backroads, but through correspondence and prearranged appointments with wealthy planters. Martha's case presented a commercial puzzle. Her literacy and household skills were premium attributes, but the 3 small children clinging to her represented a significant short-term liability. Her paper trail, which Ashworth managed with careful phrasing, showed a pattern of rapid transfers that would raise questions for an astute buyer. His solution was targeted marketing. He would sell her as a complete family unit to a specific type of client, a man of such wealth that he could absorb the cost of young children, and of such professed benevolence that he might pride himself on not breaking up a family. The client was Jonathan Whitfield, owner of Cedar Hills Plantation in eastern Alabama, a widower of 54 who had built his father's inheritance into a cotton empire through shrewd, unsentimental management. Whitfield wanted a literate woman for household correspondence and record-keeping. Through letters, Ashworth assured him Martha was perfect, presenting the children not as burdens, but as a future labor pool. The deal was struck sight unseen, a testament to the trust in a trader's word and the fungibility of the commodity. The journey westward into Alabama was the longest of Martha's life, a week of jolting travel that carried her into a new, deeper South. The landscape changed, the air grew heavier. Cedar Hills was the largest property she had yet encountered. 1,800 acres of relentless cotton, worked by nearly 300 enslaved people. The main house was a monument to opulent control, a storybook mansion that masked the brutal engine of its wealth. The plantation's organization was militarily precise, with strict segregation of function. It was here that Martha encountered a new, refined form of cruelty, systemic separation. The Cedar Hills records noted the transaction with typical dispassion. December 20th, 1843. Purchase of one female Martha, age 22, with 3 young children, ages 2 years 6 months, 1 year 5 months, and 11 weeks. Purchase price $600. Skills: literacy, correspondence, household service. Assignment: main house staff. Children to be housed in nursery quarters. Special notation: premium paid for literacy skills. For the first time, Martha was physically severed from her children. Sarah, Daniel, and Rebecca were taken to the nursery quarters, a large, barracks-like building overseen by elderly enslaved women who minded dozens of children while their parents worked across the vast plantation. Martha was assigned a tiny, cell-like room in the servants' building behind the main house, containing only a narrow cot and a trunk. She was permitted to visit her children for 1 hour on Sunday afternoons. The separation was an exquisite, ongoing torture. Sarah, not yet 3, could not understand the rules of this new prison. Every Sunday, when Martha had to leave, the little girl would wail, clinging to her mother's skirts, her pleas, "Mama, don't go," echoing in Martha's ears for the next 6 days and nights. Daniel, at 18 months, would watch her depart with wide, confused eyes, too young to articulate abandonment, but old enough to feel it. Rebecca, just 3 months old, was still nursing. Martha had to express her milk during the week, a painful, humiliating process, storing it for the Sunday visit, an inadequate solution that left both mother and child in distress. Her work, within the main house, was a study in dissonance. She entered a world of polished silver, wax floors, and hushed efficiency, a world that seemed hermetically sealed from the violent labor that sustained it. Her duties were exacting: cleaning the second-floor bedrooms, maintaining Jonathan Whitfield's meticulously ordered study, taking dictation for his business correspondence, and serving a table during his frequent, lavish entertainments. Whitfield himself was a reserved, commanding figure who rarely spoke directly to servants except to issue flawless orders. He demanded perfection. A speck of dust, a misaligned fork, a flaw in penmanship was an affront to his system. Punishment for failure was severe, but always administered by his overseers, allowing Whitfield to maintain the fiction of being above the crude realities of discipline. The work was psychologically draining, but predictable. Martha found a grim refuge in its routines. If she could make herself a perfect, invisible cog in the household machine, she could perhaps survive the agonizing week to reach that precious, fleeting hour on Sunday. She existed in a state of numb stasis, her emotions banked, her focus narrowed to survival, and the weekly glimpse of her children's faces. This precarious equilibrium was annihilated by the presence of Nathan Whitfield, Jonathan's 21-year-old son. Expelled from university for drinking and gambling, Nathan had been forced home and given the nominal role of assistant overseer as a form of punitive character building. He approached his duties with the casual, entitled cruelty of a bored prince. He drank, gambled with the white staff, and viewed the enslaved population as a collection of toys and objects for his amusement or abuse. He noticed Martha within days. He first intercepted her in an upstairs hallway as she carried linens, emerging from his room disheveled and smelling of mid-afternoon whiskey. He blocked her path, his gaze predatory. "You're the new literate one, aren't you?" he slurred. "Father says you can read and write. How does AN***** learn to read?" He thrust a book at her, demanding a performance. She read, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the page. He laughed, a harsh, delighted sound. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually can read. Father's got himself a clever one." From that moment, she became his fixation. He engineered encounters, summoning her to his perpetually disordered room on spurious errands, ordering her to read newspapers aloud as he lounged too close. The other house, servants communicated their warnings through a shared, silent language of glanced looks and subtle shakes of the head. They had seen Nathan's patterns before. Martha employed every evasion tactic she knew, finishing her work in a blur of speed, staying within groups of other servants, perfecting the art of becoming a piece of the furniture. Nothing worked. Nathan's desire was a decree, and in the universe of Cedar Hills, his decrees were law. By the spring of 1844, the fourth confirmation of her powerlessness bloomed within her. The exhaustion was total, a weight that threatened to sink her into the polished floors. For pregnancies in less than 4 years, 3 children she could only mother for 1 hour a week. The relentless work, the constant gnawing fear. She considered the ultimate evasion. The dense forest surrounding Cedar Hills whispered promises of escape. She had heard the hushed stories of those who ran, but the logistics were impossible. She could not take 3 small children and a newborn on the run. She could not leave them behind in the nursery, motherless. The arithmetic of her love trapped her as effectively as any chain. So she continued. She worked. She expressed milk. She survived Sunday goodbyes. She endured Nathan's attentions. Her body carried the pregnancy, while her spirit frayed. Her condition eventually became impossible to hide. Jonathan Whitfield noticed while she served at one of his formal dinners. A week later, after a quiet, furious investigation, he had learned everything. The confrontation with Nathan was volcanic. The house staff, moving silently through adjoining rooms, heard the explosion. Jonathan's voice, like shattering timber, condemning the stupidity, the risk, the moral squalor. Nathan's voice, defiant and dismissive. It ended with Nathan being banished to manage a remote timber operation in Mississippi, an exile not for Martha's sake, but to protect the Whitfield name and discipline a wayward heir. And then a deviation from the established script. Jonathan Whitfield did not sell her. The trader did not arrive in the following weeks. Months passed. Martha remained at Cedar Hills, working in the main house, visiting her increasingly confused children on Sundays. Whitfield's calculus was unclear. Perhaps selling her so soon would publicly acknowledge the scandal. Perhaps he genuinely valued her clerical skills. Perhaps he simply hadn't yet discerned the relentless pattern that trailed behind her like a shadow. For Martha, this unprecedented pause bred not peace, but a new kind of torment, anxious, watchful hope. On November 7, 1844, she gave birth to her fourth child, a son. The delivery was a crisis. Martha hemorrhaged badly, bleeding enough that the attending midwife feared for her life. For once, the preservation of property overrode standard practice. The plantation doctor was summoned, another extraordinary medical expense charged to the estate. He managed to stanch the bleeding, but Martha spent 2 weeks in the plantation infirmary, ghost pale and weak. The birth record was clinically detailed. November 7, 1844. Male infant born to Martha. Household staff. Difficult delivery. Mother suffered significant blood loss, but survived with medical intervention. Child healthy. Weight approximately 6 pounds 8 ounces. Father unknown. Medical costs $18 charged to plantation medical account. She named her son Joshua. God is salvation, a name that felt like a question hurled into a silent heaven. During her slow recovery in the infirmary, a decision was made about her older children. Sarah, now 3.5, was deemed old enough for light work. She was removed from the nursery and installed in the main house kitchen as a runner and helper. Martha discovered this only when she was finally discharged and saw her eldest daughter in the kitchen house, small hands scrubbing vegetables under the cook's watchful eye. Sarah's face lit with joy at seeing her mother, but she was not allowed to break from her task. They could only exchange a look, a bolt of love and shared sorrow, before Martha had to continue to her own duties. Her heart, already fragile, fractured a little more. For the next 8 months, Martha lived in a suspended state of dread and frail hope. She worked, saw Sarah occasionally in passing, visited Daniel, Rebecca, and baby Joshua in the nursery on Sundays. Her body healed, but left her permanently diminished. The cumulative toll of pregnancies, labor, and loss now a permanent resident in her bones. She waited for the trader's wagon, listening for its sound every day, expecting the pattern to reassert itself with violent finality. It arrived in August 1845. Not Ashworth, but another trader named Sheffield, working the same profitable routes. Jonathan Whitfield's ledgers had evidently been reviewed, the calculations of value versus trouble finalized. The cost of the medical intervention was noted, not as care, but as a debit. The Cedar Hills ledger made its final, damning entry on Martha. August 15, 1845. Sale of Martha, age 24, with 4 children ages 4 years 3 months, 3 years 2 months, 1 year 9 months, and 9 months. Sold to Sheffield Trading Company, Mobile. Sale price $550. Reason: reduction of household staff, reassignment of assets. Proceeds applied to a state modernization fund. Special notation: medical costs during recent pregnancy, $18, deducted from final asset valuation. The numbers told the story of her devaluation. She had been purchased for $600. She was now sold for $550, with an additional $18 penalty for nearly dying. Her value had plummeted, her children now firmly categorized as dependent burdens that dragged down her price. She was given 2 hours to assemble her life. The logistics were a tragic pantomime. Martha, with Joshua in a sling on her chest, holding toddler Rebecca's hand, urging 4-year-old Sarah to stay close while trying to guide 3-year-old Daniel. They were a procession of vulnerability. As Sheffield's wagon pulled away, Martha looked back not at the grand house, but at the nursery quarters. She saw the building where her children had lived apart from her, where she had spent hundreds of hours yearning through the week for a single hour of contact. For plantations, for pregnancies, for sales. Each transaction etched the same lesson deeper. Her body was not her own. Her children were not her own. Her life was a ledger entry to be balanced, and her balance was now deep in the red. She was 24 years old, holding her 4th child born of violence, and the pattern, now worn smooth with repetition, showed no sign of ending. The only thing falling faster than her monetary value was her capacity to believe it ever would. Sheffield's operation was based in Mobile, Alabama, a major port in the domestic slave trade's western expansion. For 3 weeks, Martha and her 4 children were held in a warehouse near the docks, a place of constant, ambient misery. The building was a cacophony of despair, the crying of separated children, the low prayers of men and women, the harsh barks of traders conducting business. Here, human beings were processed with the efficiency of any other commodity bound for the burgeoning cotton and sugar frontiers of the Deep South. Sheffield, assessing his inventory, saw Martha's situation as a commercial challenge. Her literacy remained a premium feature, but 4 children under the age of 5 represented a significant capital outlay with delayed returns. Her declining price history, from $800 to $550, marked her as a problematic asset, a piece of property that carried the invisible stain of past troubles. His solution was to target a buyer of particular profile, someone wealthy enough to absorb the upfront cost, sophisticated enough to value her skills, and perhaps concerned enough with appearances to prefer purchasing a family unit as a performance of paternalistic benevolence. He found his buyer in Louisiana. Henri Delacroix was a Creole planter whose family had owned Magnolia Grove for 3 generations. Educated in France and connected to New Orleans' elite society, Delacroix was a widower of 58 who managed his sugar plantation with a meticulous, intellectual detachment. He was looking for an educated domestic to manage his correspondence and household accounts. Through carefully worded letters, Sheffield presented Martha as a unique opportunity, a woman of cultivated mind, temporarily encumbered by young children who would, in time, augment his labor force. The sale was negotiated remotely. In late September 1845, Martha and her children were transported over 200 miles westward into the unfamiliar, watery landscape of Louisiana sugar country. The land itself felt alien. It was flat, swampy, cut through by slow-moving bayous. The air hung thick with the smells of decayed vegetation and the cloying sweetness of boiling cane. Magnolia Grove sat in the heart of this treacherous paradise, where the agricultural cycle was ruled by a brutal clock. Sugar cultivation was not just hard labor. It was dangerous, precision-timed slavery. The grinding season was called the killing time, for a reason. The relentless, 20-hour days processing cane before frost could ruin the crop led to exhaustion, accidents in the mills, and death. The Magnolia Grove records logged their arrival, September 28, 1845. Purchase of one female Martha, age 24, with 4 children. Ages 4 years 5 months, 3 years 4 months, 1 year 11 months, and 10 months. Previous owner, Sheffield trading via Cedar Hills Plantation, Alabama. Purchase price, $500. Skills, literacy, correspondence, household management. Assignment, main house, personal attendant to owner. Children to be housed with mother in separate cabin. Special notation, family unit purchase. Premium paid for documented literacy skills. The final clause was a small, profound revolution. Children to be housed with mother in separate cabin. After the agonizing separation at Cedar Hills, this provision felt like a miracle. Delacroix assigned them a small cabin, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and a smoking fireplace, near the main house. It was crude, but it was theirs. For the first time in years, Martha could put all her children to sleep under the same roof, could hear their breathing in the night, could reach out and touch them. Sarah, now 4 and a half, could finally fall asleep beside her mother. The relief was so overwhelming it felt dangerous. Experience had taught her that anything given could be taken away with more cruelty in the taking. Her work was as Delacroix's personal attendant. She served his meals, maintained his private chambers, a library of French novels and agricultural treatises, managed his correspondence, and assisted during his frequent, elegant gatherings for neighboring planters and New Orleans businessmen. Delacroix was a demanding, but not overtly violent employer. He expected perfection, immaculate penmanship, flawless service, anticipatory care, but his discipline was administered through a cold economy of privilege. better rations for good performance, the revocation of small freedoms for failure. It was a more psychological form of control, one that demanded complicity. He was intellectually fascinated by Martha. He would have her read to him at breakfast, passages from French novels, articles from La Bille de la Nouvelle Orleans, letters from business associates. He dictated his replies, sometimes deliberately using complex vocabulary or French phrases to observe her. When she sounded out the French words phonetically, not understanding but accurately replicating the sounds, he was visibly amused. "You have an unusual mind," he remarked once, watching her script flow across the page. "It's a waste, really. In different circumstances, you might have been educated, accomplished. But circumstances are what they are." Martha remained silent, the irony of the man who owned her body musing on her lost potential too bitter to acknowledge. The relationship Delacroix cultivated was the most insidious of all. It was not the crude, violent taking of a Carmichael or a Nathan Whitfield. It was a constructed framework of coercion disguised as benevolence. He offered gifts, an extra blanket for the cabin, cloth for the children's clothes, occasional treats from the kitchen. These were presented not as wages, but as tokens of his generosity, evidence of his enlightened management. The unspoken contract was clear. Accept these gifts, accept his attention, and this fragile stability would continue. Resist, and the cabin would be reclaimed, the children sent to the segregated quarters, the delicate peace shattered. It was not a choice. It was an ultimatum wrapped in silk. By early 1846, Martha recognized the familiar internal shift. She was pregnant for the 5th time. This realization came not with shock, but with a cold, final clarity. The pattern was now a gravitational force, an inescapable law of her existence. 5 plantations, 5 pregnancies, 5 different men, from overseer to planter's son to the master himself, enacting the same ultimate claim of ownership over her body. Her literacy, the skill that had once seemed a potential key, had only made her more visible in this predatory landscape. In her darkest moments, she contemplated the bayou that bordered the property, its dark waters offering a permanent escape. But then she would look at Sarah, now 5, whose quick eyes were already recognizing letters from watching her mother write. She would see Daniel trying so hard to be stoic, Rebecca's resilient smile, Joshua's toddler curiosity. She was now a bulwark between them and the world. Her survival was no longer for herself. That self felt already extinguished. But for them, she would endure to be their secret teacher, their silent protector, their one constant in a universe of variables. On September 3, 1846, she gave birth to her 5th child, a daughter. The plantation doctor attended, a standard practice on a wealthy sugar estate. The birth was, for once, without dire physical complication. She named this child Grace, clinging to the concept of unearned favor, a mercy she could not find on earth, but hoped might still exist somewhere. The Magnolia Grove birth record noted, September 3, 1846. Female infant born to Martha. Personal attendant to H. Delacroix. Healthy delivery, no complications. Child weight approximately 7 pounds. Mother recovered well from delivery. Father unknown. Special notation. Mother granted 2 weeks recovery period before resuming duties per H. Delacroix's specific instruction. And then the pattern broke. Weeks passed. Then months. Martha, waiting for the telltale arrival of a trader, lived in a state of high alert anxiety. But no one came. The sale that had followed every previous birth like a shadow did not materialize. For the first time, she remained on a plantation after giving birth. The reason was opaque. Perhaps Delacroix valued her service too highly. Perhaps he was unconcerned by local gossip. Perhaps he simply saw her children as a long-term investment. The motive mattered less than the effect, a pause. This pause stretched into a fragile, watchful stability. For 2 years, through the remainder of 1846, all of 1847, and into 1848, Martha worked, cared for her children, and lived with a constant, low-grade fear that the other shoe would drop. But it did not. During these years, her children grew at Magnolia Grove. Sarah turned 7 and was put to light work in the main house. Daniel, at 6, carried water during the grinding season. Rebecca, 5, learned to sew. Joshua and baby Grace stayed in the cabin under the care of an elderly woman while Martha worked. It was not freedom. It was not justice. But it was continuity. It was the ability to see her children daily, to feed them, to whisper lessons to Sarah in the dark, to offer what protection a mother with no rights could offer. She dared, against every instinct, to hope for nothing more than for this painful stasis to continue. It ended with a death, not a sale. On October 14, 1848, Henri Delacroix was found at his desk in his study, having succumbed to a massive heart condition. His death was sudden, and it unraveled everything. He had 3 daughters, all married and living in New Orleans, none of whom wished to manage a sugar plantation. To settle the estate and divide the proceeds, everything was to be auctioned: the land, the machinery, the mill, and the movable property. The 212 enslaved people. The plantation auction was held on December 12, 1848. Buyers came from across Louisiana and Mississippi. Martha and her 5 children were paraded, inspected, and assessed as a single lot. The children, ranging from 2 to 7 years old, were no longer mere dependents, but held discernible future value. Yet the sheer number of them, and Martha's own worn condition, capped the price. The sale document was the final, summarizing entry of her documented journey. December 12, 1848. Estate auction of Magnolia Grove Properties. Lot 47, one female Martha, age 28, with 5 children, ages 7, 6, 5, 3, 2. Skills: literacy, household management, correspondence. Sale price: $475 to William Foster, Cotton Factor, Jackson, Mississippi. Special notation: family unit price reflects significant dependent burden. $475. That was the total value of Martha and her 5 children after 8 years, 5 plantations, and 5 pregnancies. Less than $80 per person. As she climbed into William Foster's wagon for the final leg of her recorded life, she performed the now ritualistic glance backward. She did not look at the grand house, but at the small, smoky cabin that had been their brief refuge. She was 28 years old. What followed was a descent into historical silence. Researchers would later trace one final, faint ghost in the records: a property transfer in 1853, showing a Martha, age 32, sold to a plantation in eastern Texas for $275. The price, now in catastrophic freefall, spoke of accumulated physical depletion and the indelible mark of being problematic. After that, the trail vanishes completely. No death certificate, no manumission paper, no record in contraband camps during the Civil War or in the Freedmen's Bureau archives after it. The most likely truths are the bleakest. She may have died in the 1850s, her death unrecorded because an exhausted, depreciated, enslaved woman's passing affected no ledger's bottom line. She may have survived until emancipation in 1865, but joined the millions of freed people who lived and died outside the reach of official documentation, their stories existing only in ephemeral oral memory. She may have escaped in the chaos of war, her identity lost in the tumult of liberation. Her children were scattered by the trade's ruthless logic. Researchers found a record of Sarah, sold separately at age 10 in 1851. Her literacy noted as a curiosity. Daniel appeared in a Mississippi probate record. The fates of Rebecca, Joshua, and Grace were swallowed by history, leaving not even a fragmentary trace. Magnolia Grove represented the end of the trail not because her suffering ended, but because the system's interest in documenting it did. When her economic value fell below a certain threshold, when she was no longer a noteworthy asset moving between major plantations, she disappeared from the written world. The ledgers, so meticulous in tracking her devaluation, simply stopped caring. Her story, as told by the oppressor's record-keeping, concludes with a final price and a journey into Mississippi. The rest, her endurance, her love, her unknown fate, exists in the vast, unrecorded silence that was the true destination for so many. The paper trail ended, but her life, in all its unseen resilience and tragedy, almost certainly continued somewhere beyond the ledger's cruel, indifferent gaze. The story of Martha did not end with her disappearance into Mississippi in 1848, or even with her final ghostly appearance in a Texas bill of sale in 1853. It entered a century and a half of dormancy, pressed between the pages of ledgers stored in courthouse basements and archive boxes, waiting for a reader who would see not just columns of data, but the connective tissue of a human tragedy. Its resurrection began not with a shout, but with the quiet, persistent whir of a document scanner in a climate-controlled room in 2009. Rebecca Chen, the graduate student intern, was deep in the tedious, essential work of the Richmond County Historical Preservation Project. The task was digitization, saving the past from physical decay and obscurity. For hours, her world was the pale glow of a screen and the faded, spidery script of 19th-century clerks. She entered metadata, names, dates, prices, from plantation transfer logs, the financial pulse of the antebellum South. It was work that could numb the mind, turning human beings into data points. But Rebecca's historical training had attuned her to anomalies, to patterns that whispered of larger truths. On that Tuesday afternoon in March, the pattern emerged. The name Martha appeared, and then appeared again, then again. Each entry, from a different county and year, contained echoing details, approximations of age that progressed logically, the rare and consistent notation of literate, the accumulating number of children. Her historian's mind, trained in quantitative analysis, began assembling the fragments. She created a simple timeline on a notepad, then a spreadsheet. What crystallized was not a random series of transactions, but a chillingly precise algorithm of exploitation. 5 plantations, 5 births, 5 sales, all within a 7-year window. The mathematical synchronicity was so stark it felt accusatory. This was not a coincidence. It was a documented system in operation. The moment was one of cold, clarifying shock. The abstract theories of her graduate seminars, the economics of the domestic slave trade, the sexual dynamics of power under slavery, suddenly had a name, a face, a brutal paper trail. With careful hands, she gathered the printouts and approached her faculty supervisor, Dr. James Morton, a historian renowned for his work on slavery's economic architectures. "I think I've found something," she said, her voice low with the weight of it. "You need to see this." What followed was not a single discovery, but a years-long process of historical detective work. Dr. Morton and Rebecca became forensic accountants of human suffering. They spent weeks, then months, verifying the chain. They cross-referenced dusty deed books from Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, tracked down plantation inventories in university archives, and requested probate records from county clerks across the South. They were building a case, but there was no court to hear it except the court of history. Their research revealed the ledgers not as mere accounting tools, but as a cold, precise map of a conspiracy of silence. Each sale following a birth was not a random business decision. It was a strategic relocation to manage scandal. The birth records with their repeated perfunctory father, unknown, were exposed as deliberate, legally sanctioned fictions. This phrase was not an absence of information, but an active construction, a lie inscribed in official ink to protect white men from social repercussion and legal responsibility, while permanently branding the mother and child with the stigma of the unknown. They extended their search beyond Martha's immediate entries. Pulling employment records, personal letters, and local newspapers, they tracked the men. Dutch Carmichael was dismissed from Riverside and later from 2 other positions under similar clouds. Edmund Beaumont was sidelined at Fairmont and later appeared in Missouri court records entangled in another paternity dispute with an enslaved woman. James Prescott was exiled to a remote family holding. Preserved family letters spoke of inappropriate conduct, requiring his removal. Nathan Whitfield died at 29 in Mississippi, a newspaper noting his dissipated habits. Only Henri Delacroix, who died naturally, escaped immediate consequence. The pattern was clear. The perpetrators faced social inconvenience, a dismissal and exile, a familial reprimand, but never legal jeopardy. The law did not recognize a crime against property. In 2011, Morton and Chun published their findings in the Journal of Southern History under the title Systematic Exploitation and Forced Migration, a case study in antebellum sexual violence and economic devaluation. The academic article was a seismic event in historical circles. It provided irrefutable, data-driven evidence for what had often been argued anecdotally, that the forced migration of enslaved women was frequently a mechanism for concealing sexual violence and managing its problematic outcomes, children. The ledger was revealed as both a record of commerce and an instrument of cover-up. But for Rebecca Chun, the academic publication was not the end. It was a beginning. The question now haunted her: what happened to them? The research had focused on the pattern of Martha's life, but the fates of her children, Sarah, Daniel, Rebecca, Joshua, and Grace, remained void. She embarked on a second, more emotionally taxing phase of research, a quest through the fragmentary records of severed families. The search was like assembling a shattered vase with most of the pieces missing. She combed through auction records from Mississippi, labor contracts from the Reconstruction era, Freedmen's Bureau marriage certificates, and sharecropping agreements. The results were a heartbreaking testimony to the slave trade's fundamental violence, the destruction of kinship. Sarah, the firstborn, was traced to a bill of sale in Jackson, Mississippi, in August 1851. Listed as female, age 10, literate, trained in household service, she was purchased separately from her family for $650 by a planter named Robert Clemens. Her literacy, the skill inherited from her mother, was now her own marketable trait. She appeared once more in an 1860 inventory as Sarah, age 19, household staff, and then vanished, her fate after emancipation lost. Daniel surfaced in an 1853 probate inventory from Natchez, valued at $700 as an 11-year-old field hand. Later, a single, tantalizing record from 1870 showed a Daniel, age 28, signing a labor contract as a freedman on a Louisiana plantation. If it was him, he had survived slavery only to be ensnared in the debt peonage of sharecropping. For Rebecca, Joshua, and Grace, the archives yielded nothing. The silence was profound. Children so young were often sold to child-raising plantations, to be conditioned into the system from infancy, or they perished from the high mortality rates that plagued enslaved children. Their disappearance from the record was itself a kind of evidence of their utter vulnerability, of the system's disregard for the very young once they were separated from a mother who might remember their names. The search for Martha, after 1853, proved even more futile. The 1853 Texas sale was the last definitive trace. Rebecca searched through Civil War contraband, records of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, through Freedmen's Bureau rolls of newly freed people seeking to legalize marriages or find family, through post-war census records. Martha was not there. The most probable explanations are bleakly simple. She may have died in the 1850s, her death as unrecorded as the deaths of countless others whose value had been exhausted. She may have survived until 1865, but lived and died in the obscurity of rural freedom, her name never making it into a federal document. The system that had so meticulously documented her economic devaluation had, when that value reached its nadir, simply stopped recording her at all. Her erasure was the final phase of the exploitation. The numbers that emerge from the ledgers tell a stark, numerical story of this process. 8 years, the documented span of her odyssey, 1840 to 1848. 5 plantations: Riverside, Fairmont, Oakwood, Cedar Hills, Magnolia Grove. 5 children: Sarah, Daniel, Rebecca, Joshua, Grace. 6 sales: the number of times she was formally transferred as chattel, $800 to $275. The precipitous decline in her monetary value, a 66% devaluation. 5 men, the overseers and owners' sons implicated. 0 prosecutions, the number of legal actions taken against any of them. 160+ years, the time between her disappearance and the recovery of her story. But as Dr. Morton wrote in a later reflective article, these numbers are the skeleton. They give the story its shape and its horrifying scale. But they cannot capture the breath, the blood, the spirit. They cannot show Martha holding each newborn, knowing the clock was already ticking. They cannot measure the silence in the wagon after each sale or the weight of a child's hand in hers during a Sunday visit. They cannot quantify the love that persisted in that cabin at Magnolia Grove, or the quiet resistance of teaching a child to read in a world that forbade it. The legacy of this discovery is multifaceted. The digitized ledger pages are now preserved at the University of Georgia, used in classrooms to teach students how to read between the lines of historical documents. They have been featured in museum exhibits on the domestic slave trade, putting names and narratives to the statistics. For descendants of enslaved people searching for their roots, Martha's story is both a beacon and a caution, a demonstration of how much can be found and how much was deliberately lost. Ultimately, Martha's recovered narrative does two vital things. First, it forces a reckoning with the calculated, bureaucratic cruelty of slavery. It reveals a system so morally bankrupt that it could turn repeated sexual violence into a routine business problem, solved through ledger entries and strategic relocation. The banality of the evil is in the bookkeeping. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it is a testament to incalculable human endurance. The ledgers documented what was done to Martha, but between those lines, we can infer the strength within her. Her story is one of survival not for survival's sake, but for the sake of 5 children. It is a story of love that defied a system designed to make love a vulnerability. The courthouse ledgers documented her price in dollars and cents with perfect precision, but they could never measure, and thus could never diminish, her value as a human being, a mother, and a survivor. Martha's story, once reduced to cryptic entries in forgotten books, now echoes as a powerful corrective. It ensures that she, and the millions whose stories exist only in the silent spaces between the official records, in the unarchived family lore, or in the lost graves without markers, are never completely forgotten. Her name, just her first name, the only one the ledgers ever acknowledged, has been reclaimed. It is no longer just an entry in a column of assets. It is a vessel for memory, a challenge to historical amnesia, and a permanent witness to both the depths of human cruelty and the unquenchable resilience of the human spirit.